start of the 17th century, the eastern oyster flourished throughout the Chesapeake Bay. When John Smith arrived on the Virginia coast in 1607, he remarked the oysters lay as thick as stones along the bay floor. Other European settlers reported navigational hazards to their ships caused by enormous oyster reefs that thrust up from the bay's bottom. Prior to the arrival of European settlers, Native American groups living along the Chesapeake Bay had been making widespread use of these thriving oyster populations as both food sources and construction material for millennia. Archaeologically recovered evidence, such as shell rings and shell mounds, show that Native Americans actively harvested oysters starting around 2000 BC and continuing all the way through the 18th century. That's close to 4,000 years. If anyone has ever visited the Chesapeake Bay today, you probably know that these thriving reefs no longer exist. In the decades following colonization, overharvesting, pollution, and disease contributed to a steep decline of oyster populations in the bay. The destructive harvesting techniques employed by the colonists led to the loss of roughly 3/4 of the population of the bay's oyster reefs between 1860 and 1920. Today, oyster populations in the bay are at a small fraction of their historical population size. I find it astonishing that the Native Americans were able to maintain a thriving oyster population over several millennia, while the European colonists collapsed the once great oyster fishery in a few hundred years. These circumstances became the inspiration of my honors thesis. The intent of my thesis is to offer a deeper historical perspective on the roots of oyster fishery collapse by highlighting both beneficial and detrimental management techniques used throughout time. My thesis looks at two specific trends. First, how Native American oyster harvesting practices and reef management techniques evolved during their occupation to foster a resilient fishery, and second, how Native American practices differed from those of the colonists. These trends were explored through the analysis of over 4,000 archaeologically recovered oysters from several shell middens and roasting pits at a site located along the York River. My results add to discussions surrounding sustainability and ecosystem reconstruction by uncovering some of the practices used by Native Americans living in Tidewater, Virginia, that produced a long-term, sustainable, and resilient oyster fishery. My objective is to provide a more human-centric assessment of oyster reef conditions that can be factored into the development of ecosystem baselines and assist in informing oyster restoration policy and initiatives. Understanding the past dynamics between humans and their environment offer a unique standpoint in preparing for future restoration goals. As a keystone species, the oyster plays a vital role in the ecosystem of the Chesapeake. They build habitats for other species, filter water, and represent a crucial component in the food chain. Without these once thriving oyster populations, the Chesapeake Bay has become one of the best examples of how modern humans have mismanaged nature's bounty. As a native to coastal Virginia, this is not something I'm proud of. However, with some effort and the right management techniques, I believe that oysters may one day again thrive in the bay, but we need to act now before it's too late. Thank you so much.